Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, January 9th, 2025. All right, the first one at the top of antiwar.com today. Israel killed 74 children in the first week of 2025. So this is a very grim statistic here. According to the UN's Child Relief Agency, UNICEF, US-backed Israeli attacks on Gaza killed at least 74 children in just the first week of 2025. UNICEF said on Wednesday, quote, children have reportedly been killed in several mass casualty events, including nighttime attacks in Gaza City, Khan Yunis, and Al-Mawasi, a unilaterally designated safe zone in the south, end quote. And it was on Tuesday night, I covered this yesterday, that an Israeli strike on Al-Mawasi in southern Gaza killed 5 displaced children who were sheltering in tents. And the IDF has repeatedly bombed Al-Mawasi despite designating it as a so-called safe zone, humanitarian safe zone, they call it. This picture here is of Palestinian children. This is from Tuesday, and they're sheltering at a school in Deir al-Balah. And, you see them happy and smiling. It's amazing. Kids are amazing that they're living through this, yet they could still play together and have fun. I thought I would put kind of a nice picture in this very sad story. Palestinian children are also dying due to the conditions caused by the Israeli siege and relentless bombing campaign. UNICEF said that since December 26th, 8 infants and newborns have reportedly died from hypothermia, a major threat to young children who are unable to regulate their body temperature, especially babies born prematurely. I know in one case it was twins who were born a month premature, and they were not in incubators. They were in tents the temperature was in the 40s at night, which, you have all these Israel defenders pointing out the weather in Gaza doesn't get below freezing. But if you're a newborn baby living in a tent, I mean, anybody with kids knows that that's just not an acceptable situation, especially tattered tents that they've been living in for more than a year. So Gaza health officials said in December 2023 that 17,000 children had been killed in the genocidal war, a number that does not include those missing and wounded under the rubble. I said missing and wounded. I should write missing and presumed dead under the rubble. And it does not include these indirect deaths that we see. And a lot of newborn babies have died. They're especially vulnerable. This is how it always goes in conflicts like this with blockades. But in Gaza, it just seems, because they're being born prematurely, because of the health conditions of their mothers. A lot of the mothers cannot make milk because they're suffering from malnutrition, and there's shortages of formula. I point back to this article from the New York Times back in October. Well, it was really, they published accounts from American healthcare workers who volunteered in Gaza, including many who worked with babies. And there was, a lot of quotes in there about newborn babies dying. And this is from Dr. Amen Oda. She's a pediatrician from Texas. She said, quote, I worked in a neonatal ICU. Several infants died every day due to the lack of medical supplies and appropriate nutrition. We had to make tough decisions about which very sick baby would be on the ventilator due to the lack of equipment. I saw a family bringing in their dead 3-day-old infant who had been living in a tent, end quote. And despite this slaughter of children and so many newborn babies dying due to this siege, the Biden administration has continued to provide military aid and political support to Israel, as you're all well aware of. And this is it's a war on these children. There's a lot of children in Gaza, and just so many of them are being killed. As we talk about every day, basically. When I do the daily updates on the violence in Gaza, I don't always mention, it's not always clear how many children died or how many women died in a strike, but when it is, I always mention it. And this is what our taxes, this is what the U.S. government is funding and supporting every single day in Gaza. The next one here, Israeli strikes on Gaza kill 51 over 24 hours. So this is the update on the violence. And the information, there's been just lately with everything else going on, there's been less and less coverage of Gaza. So that's why I'm trying to make a point to make it, a top story for us. Gaza's health ministry said Wednesday that Israeli attacks across the Strip killed at least 51 Palestinians and wounded 78 as the U.S.-backed daily slaughter continues. The ministry's numbers only account for dead and wounded Palestinians brought to hospitals. They said there's still a number of victims under the rubble and in areas where rescue crews cannot reach them. Very sad picture in this article here. Israeli attacks on Tuesday included heavy strikes on Gaza City in the north. According to Reuters, a bombing of a multi-story house in Sheikh Radwan neighborhood killed at least 10, while another 5 were killed by an attack on the nearby Zaytun suburb. This picture here is a man holding his son who was 15 days old and who was killed by the Israeli strikes on Gaza City. So another newborn baby killed by Israel. And there were strikes in central Gaza. At least 3 Palestinians were killed there. Another baby was killed, according to Al Jazeera, in the Barej refugee camp in central Gaza. So 2 very sad stories to start with here. All right, the next one, it's not getting much better. Israel kills 2 children in an airstrike in the occupied West Bank. This article's from Middle East Eye. Israel has killed 3 Palestinians, including 2 children, in an airstrike in the occupied West Bank town of Tamun on Wednesday. Palestinian sources said the 3 victims of the attack near the city of Tubas in the north of the occupied territory were cousins. They were named locally as 24-year-old Adam Bisharat, as well as Hamza Bisharat, age 10, and Rita, who was 8 years old. 2 airstrikes in Tamun within the past 24 hours have left 5 Palestinians dead. Israeli media outlets said the attack, which targeted the yard outside the victim's family, had liquidated an armed Palestinian cell. Locals said the Israeli army arrived at the scene soon after the attack and seized the bodies of those killed, preventing Palestinian medical teams from attempting to administer medical aid. Speaking to Middle East Eye, Obai Bisharat, the brother of Adam, said he was inside his family home when he heard the sound of an explosion outside. He rushed outside to discover his brother and young cousins covered in blood without any signs of life. He said, quote, "I tried moving them to pull them away from the place, but I was surprised by how fast the Israeli army stormed the area. The soldiers pushed me away, took away my phone, and forced me to the ground," end quote. The soldiers then raided the house and assaulted its residents before making off with the body. Palestinian medical sources told Middle East Eye that they rushed to the scene when they heard the explosion. However, the ambulance was blocked. So Israel's claiming that they killed some armed Palestinians, and a total of 5 were killed in the area, and 2 of them were these very young children. All right, so the next one here, Israel blocks probe fearing inquiry of sexual abuse of Palestinians. This article's from The Cradle. So Israeli officials have obstructed a UN investigation into alleged sexual crimes committed by Hamas fighters during the October 7th attack on southern Israel, fearing this would open the door to a probe into the rampant allegations of sexual violence against Palestinians inside Israeli torture camps. And this was reported by Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper. Israel rejected a request from Pramila Patten, the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, to investigate the allegations against Hamas after she established that a necessary condition would be access to Israeli detention centers to probe claims against Israeli soldiers. Mia Shokan, the director of the International Department of the Israeli Women's Lobby, told Haaretz, quote, "The clear concern is that Israel will be the one to be added to the blacklist of entities and countries that engage in sexual violence in conflicts, while the terrorist organization Hamas will actually remain off the list," end quote. Patton's office previously confirmed plans to explore a future mission to the region following invitations from both the PA and the Israeli government. Thursday's report comes mere days after Israeli prosecutor Moran Gaz confirmed during an interview with Hebrew language media that no allegations of rape or sexual assault by Hamas on October 7th have been filed. She said, quote, "In the end, we don't have any complaints. What was presented in the media compared to what will eventually come together will be entirely different." She said her office approached women's rights organizations and asked for cooperation. They told us that no one had approached them, end quote. Multiple media outlets have debunked the claims of Hamas rape on October 7th. So this is a narrative we saw pushed really big by the New York Times. And if you see the ICC in their warrant for Mohammed Daif, the head of the Qassams brigades, the Hamas's military wing, despite all these claims about rape on October 7th, in the October 7th attack, there's just been no evidence of it. And that, again, back to the ICC warrant, he indicts Daif over allegations of, some sexual violence and rape allegations, but those are from the people who are held hostage in Gaza. There was nothing in there about sexual violence on October 7th. And if you watch Max Blumenthal's documentary that they did, the Gray Zone, I'm blanking on the name of it off the top of my head. It was about the atrocity propaganda. It's interesting because it lays out the timeline. We saw all this stuff about beheaded babies that turned out to be nonsense, kind of right in the aftermath of October 7th. And in November, when, the world was kind of turning against Israel because of how badly they were bombing Gaza, that's when we started to see kind of the mass rape claims show up. And it has served the purpose to justify continuing to arm Israel and support all these atrocities in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, U.S. launches more airstrikes on Yemen. So the U.S. military said Wednesday that it launched more strikes on Yemen, claiming to target underground Houthi weapons storage facilities. U.S. Central Command CENTCOM said that its forces, quote, conducted multiple precision strikes against 2 Iranian-backed Houthi underground advanced conventional weapons storage facilities within Houthi-controlled territories of Yemen, end quote. So, it's funny. I don't know if you caught in the article about Israel killing all these children. I call them U.S.-backed attacks. I try to refer to what Israel does as U.S.-backed because the important context for us as Americans, or most people who listen to this are Americans, is that the U.S. is backing these attacks. And I also do it because of the media is always calling groups like the Houthis, they always call them Iranian-backed. But when it comes to Iran's support for the Houthis, it's nowhere near the extent of like the U.S. support for Israel. We don't even really know the full extent of it. The theory is that Iran has helped them with like blueprint designs, build these missiles and drones, but that they've actually been made domestically in Yemen. But anyway, that was an aside. So the U.S. claimed there was these strikes. Yemeni media reported 5 airstrikes in the Amran province and 2 in Yemen's capital, Sana'a. It's unclear if there were any casualties in the attacks, which Yemeni media reported as U.S.-British airstrikes. The UK has joined the U.S. in several rounds of airstrikes on Yemen, but it's unclear if British forces were involved in the latest bombing. CENTCOM claimed that the Houthis used the, quote, facilities to conduct attacks against U.S. Navy warships and merchant vessels in the southern Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, end quote. In recent weeks, the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, have stepped up their attacks on U.S. warships and on Israel, despite a nearly year-long U.S. bombing campaign against them. In one incident, the U.S. ended up shooting down its own Fa-18 fighter jet while intercepting Houthi missile and drones. So January 12th, it's coming up, the 1-year anniversary of this U.S. bombing campaign against the Houthis. The U.S. has bombed Yemen for years, but this is the first direct bombing campaign against the Houthis that the U.S. has launched. They backed the Saudis and the UAE against them, of course. But Biden launched this bombing campaign to defend Israeli shipping, completely illegal, no constitutional authority for anything like that at all, of course. And Ansar Allah, they started targeting Israeli shipping, Israeli-linked shipping in response to what's happening in Gaza. And they said, the ceasefire in Gaza is the only thing that'll make them stop. So since the U.S. started the bombing campaign, things have only escalated. And now there's Israeli media reports, which I didn't see, but thanks to Daniel Larison, who wrote a story about this for Responsible Statecraft, The Jerusalem Post is reporting that Trump might escalate attacks on Houthis. That's what his people are talking about, is increasing the bombing campaign. And that's something I actually predicted. You know, I don't usually try to predict things, but one thing I just have like the feeling of is that they're going to sell Trump on increasing the bombing in Yemen by saying it's just going to be like ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Remember, you obliterated them. All you got to do is just ramp up, you know, loosen the rules of engagement here. Let's just really ramp things up. And I could see him being convinced to do that, but hopefully that doesn't happen. So anyway, and he did take a very hard line against Yemen when he was president. He backed the Saudis very strongly, and he vetoed. There was actually a congressional war powers resolution to end that war, to end U.S. involvement in the war, and Trump vetoed that. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. launches an airstrike in Somalia, claims 10 Al-Shabaab killed. So another strike in Somalia. U.S. Africa Command said on Tuesday that its forces launched an airstrike in southern Somalia on December 31st, which it claimed killed 10 Al-Shabaab militants. The command said the strike was launched on a town about 35 kilometers southwest of the southern port city of Kismayo. AFRICOM claimed that its initial post-strike assessment found no civilians were harmed, though the Pentagon is notorious for hiding civilian casualties in Somalia. AFRICOM framed the attack as a collective self-defense airstrike since it was launched in support of the Mogadishu-based government's forces fighting on the ground. AFRICOM said, quote, in addition to the airstrike, U.S. forces provided support to Somali forces by evacuating soldiers that were attacked while fighting the terrorist group, end quote. So the strike was the second that AFRICOM launched in December. The last U.S. attack took place on December 24th. And that was the first known U.S. airstrike in Somalia since July 15th, 2024. So there was a big lull in U.S. airstrikes, at least ones that we are aware of. It's always possible the CIA is doing drone strikes. But AFRICOM claimed that the December 24th strike killed a senior Al-Shabaab leader, Mohammed Meyer. And these renewed U.S. airstrikes come as the U.S.-backed government in Yemen has been losing power in Jubaland, which is the southernmost federal state of Somalia. Somalia is broken up into these federal states. And the U.S.-backed government, you know, the federal government in Mogadishu, they rejected Jubaland's November election results, and that led to Jubaland suspending relations with Mogadishu. And then there was fighting between these two, between the local forces and the federal government. And the local forces are backed by Ethiopia. So it's just another area of Somalia where the federal government has lost control. They don't control much of Somalia. You have Puntland in the north. They broke ties with Mogadishu. And then, of course, Somaliland. You know, it just goes to show, like, if I'm not sure exactly what the map looks like, but this government that the U.S. backs just does not have much control within the borders when you look at a map of Somalia. And both of the recent U.S. airstrikes took place in this area. In Jubaland in the south, there's concerns that Al-Shabaab is taking advantage of the crisis and everything. So Al-Shabaab, you know, the U.S. basically says they're like the biggest threat when it comes to the terrorist organizations, the Al-Qaeda affiliates. But it's widely believed, you know, experts on Somalia all essentially say that they don't have ambitions outside of Somalia. And Al-Shabaab, their history, they were born out of a U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion of Somalia in 2006 that toppled the Islamic Courts Union. That was a coalition of Muslim groups who briefly held power in Mogadishu after ousting CIA-backed warlords. Scott Horton's book, Enough Already, he actually published it, basically the whole chapter, I think. But you could just read his chapter on Somalia in his book, Enough Already, and it gives you a really good background of kind of the U.S. involvement there. One of the things that really goes under the radar is the U.S. interventions in Somalia. All right, so the next one here, Turkey threatens new ops against Syrian Kurds. This one's from Jason Ditz. So the Turkish-backed self-proclaimed Syrian National Army has been struggling in recent offensives against the U.S.-backed Kurdish SDF. Reportedly now, substantial reinforcements are being sent to the outskirts of Kobani, but perhaps more significantly, Turkey is threatening new cross-border operations against the SDF. Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan insisted Tuesday that Turkey would do whatever is necessary against the Kurds, up to and including military operations. Turkey has been building up its military presence on the Syrian border for weeks while demanding the Kurds disarm and that the U.S. stop backing the Kurds in general. Concurrently, Turkey has carried out artillery and drone strikes against Kurdish targets. So Turkey's drone strikes appear to be focused on an attempt to prevent the SDF from sending reinforcements, particularly around this Tishreen Dam, where there's been this really heavy fighting and hundreds have been killed. So again, you have Turkey really threatening to get more involved in this fighting. All right, the next one here: Israeli troops beat and arrest a French journalist in South Syria. Another one here from Jason. So Israeli troops continue to advance deeper into southern Syria, particularly in the Quneitra Governorate, where they are occupying a growing amount of territory and have been expelling Syrian civilians from the area. Foreign media has been trying to offer more and more coverage of those operations. French journalist Sylvain Mercadier, I know I did not pronounce that the proper French way, but he was in this area covering the Israeli invasion. He was beaten by Israeli forces and captured alongside his Syrian lawyer. Israeli officials claim the journalist had gotten too close to the Israeli troops in the village of El Himada. Mercadier has reportedly been released after 5 hours in Israeli custody. Blindfolded and on his knees, Israeli troops called him a mercenary and confiscated his camera, memory cards. They also reportedly took $200 in cash from his lawyer. So they continue to push further into southern Syria. Another thing we're just really not hearing much about. Actually, it's the same thing with the fighting between the Kurds and the Turkish-backed forces, and it just seems like these aspects of Syria, all the coverages of what HTS is doing, and it's all kind of favorable coverage that we see. Meanwhile, there's this Israeli invasion ongoing and this very heavy fighting happening in the north. All right, so the next one here: Biden administration will not revoke HTS terror designation. So the Washington Post reported Wednesday that President Biden will not revoke the terror designation of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the al-Qaeda offshoot that took power in Damascus following the ouster of former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. That means Syria's de facto leader and founder of HTS, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, or Ahmad al-Shara, which is his real name, he will still be considered a terrorist by the U.S. government for the remainder of the Biden administration. The U.S. did remove the $10 million bounty from his head, and they've issued a license waiving some sanctions to allow transactions with the HTS-led government, but they're not going to remove the terror designation. We'll see how the Trump administration approaches Syria. All right, so the next one here: the U.S. completes a $9 billion upgrade of B-61 nukes. So the U.S. has completed a $9 billion plan to upgrade its B-61 nuclear air-dropped gravity bombs to the latest variant, known as the B-61-12. And under NATO's nuclear sharing program, the U.S. has B-61 bombs deployed to U.S. Air Force bases, as well as bases in European NATO countries. Under NATO's nuclear sharing program, B-61 bombs are deployed in Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, and Turkey. Politico reported back in 2022 that the U.S. had accelerated the upgrade of the B-61 bombs in Europe amid heightened tensions with Russia. The Energy Department's National Nuclear Security Administration, the NNSA, said in a press release on Tuesday that the, quote, B-61-12 life extension program was completed on December 18, 2024. They said the upgrade extends the service life by at least 20 years through refurbishing, reusing, or replacing all the bomb's nuclear and non-nuclear components. The B-61-12 is said to be lighter and more accurate than the previous variant. The NNSA said, quote, the B-61 family of bombs has over 50 years of service, making it the oldest and most versatile weapon in the enduring U.S. nuclear weapon stockpile, end quote. So the upgrade of the B-61 is part of the U.S.'s modernization of its nuclear triad, a project that has a huge price tag. So according to Arms Control Today, the NNSA will spend an estimated $650 billion over the next 25 years, and modernizing all of the U.S.'s nuclear forces will cost a total of $1.5 trillion. And this is modernizing, upgrading just the existing U.S. nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear stockpile. And this is one of the reasons why, they need tensions to be high with Russia and China, because this is just huge money to be made here. And, they're not going to want to sign any arms control treaties and reduce the nuclear stockpiles if that's going to mean cutting into this modernization. Again, it's just huge, huge money. So they just finished upgrading the B-6112, and they're already in the process of developing the next B-61 variant. It's just a never-ending work for them. The NNSA said, quote, with production of the B-6112 LEP now complete, the NNSA will transition to producing the B-6113 bomb, which will leverage the current established production capabilities supporting the B-6112. End quote. Lots of work for them to do, money to make. All right, the next one here, U.S. sanctions a senior official in Hungary. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Washington has sanctioned a top official in the Hungarian government alleging corruption. Budapest fired back, saying the designation was an act of personal revenge by the outgoing Biden administration. So Antal Rogin, a member of the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's cabinet, was placed under sanctions by the Treasury Department on Tuesday. Acting Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, Bradley Smith, said, quote, the United States will not hesitate to hold accountable individuals like Rogin, who use the power of their office to illicitly enrich themselves and their cronies at the expense of their country and their fellow citizens, end quote. However, Hungary believes the corruption charge is just an excuse, as the Biden administration is seeking personal revenge against Budapest. And I think that's clearly why they're targeting the Orban government for a few reasons. One is that Orban has been against the proxy war in Ukraine this whole time, very consistently. He's impeded EU sanctions and stuff, held things up. And also he's friendly with Trump, and he's is openly supportive of Trump. So, I think that's it. And it's his, when he was the head of the EU recently, he went over to Moscow, he went over to Beijing. That's another thing. Hungary is very close. They have good ties with China. That's something the U.S. and a lot of the, Western EU doesn't like now, because the EU, even though many of them were doing a lot of business with China. Obviously the U.S. still does business with China, but a lot of the EU countries are following the U.S. and trying to, sanctioning China and everything. But it's clearly that's the reason why they're going after Hungary, this government, this Orban government. All right, the last story here. Trump posts video of Jeffrey Sachs slamming Netanyahu. So this is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. So President-elect Donald Trump shared a video featuring Columbia professor Jeffrey Sachs sharply criticizing U.S. Middle East policy and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's role in leading the U.S. into wars. In the video, Sachs says Netanyahu is a deep, dark son of a bitch who led the U.S. into multiple follies in the Middle East and now wants America to fight a war with Iran on Israel's behalf. Sachs said in the video, quote, Netanyahu had from 1995 onward the theory that the only way we're going to get rid of Hamas and Hezbollah is by toppling the governments that support them. That's Iraq, Iran, and Syria. The guy is nothing if not obsessive. He's gotten us into endless wars, and because of the power of all of this in U.S. politics, he's gotten his way, end quote. So if you look at the post on Truth Social, you see a tweet here, and it is about, because the video starts with him criticizing Obama and the Syria policy and everything, and then he doesn't get into
the war in Syria
Netanyahu until about a minute and a half, I don't think.
And the way it is...
hopefully Trump watched the whole thing and decided to share it, but again, the way his rhetoric about Israel, it's not very hopeful here. But Jeffrey Sachs has really been on a roll here. The picture Kyle has is of him on Tucker Carlson. He was on there recently and just railed against Israel for like the whole time. It was pretty great. And it really upset a lot of the, Israel supporters. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Medea Benjamin, What will pro-Palestine activists face with Trump in the White House? One from Ted Snyder, U.S. always knew NATO expansion led to war. One from Belen Fernandez, Trump and the Great Panama Canal Tantrum. One from Bryce Green, the U.S. is manufacturing doubt about Gaza's famine. One from Daniel Larison that I mentioned, is Trump poised to double down on Biden's Yemen failures? So please go check all of that out. That's it for me for today. One more show this week after this. You could always support the show by liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing it with your friends, telling them about this show on antiwar.com. Follow us on social media, Instagram, TikTok now, and Twitter. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.